Well, thank you for joining me again for some more dark tales from Scotland's shores. And I'm sharing these stories, just as before, from Sanquhar tolbooth here in Upper Nithsdale. And Upper Nithsdale really is the spiritual home of the Festival of Folklore. And no doubt at some point over this weekend festival events, some people will make mention of the witches of Croic. And Croic Mill is just nearby here. But I'm going to tell you some tales of witches, but going a bit further out, going out towards the coast and along the shoreline of Scotland. There are many tales of witches. Perhaps one of the most famous is those of the North Berwick witches. Those people who were accused by King James VI of trying to wreck his ship and drown him and his queen as they travelled across the sea towards Scotland. And it brought them to trial and much troubles. And in those days, at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th, when there was great fear of witchcraft, people said witches could raise storms at sea by either drowning a cat, in a symbol of how those at sea would be drowned, or taking a wet rag and beating the sodden rag over a stone 3 times in the name of the devil, or to calm a storm, to dry that rag and once again beating it over a stone 3 times in the name of the devil. And there were those who said that they had seen witches sailing upon the sea, sailing in a sieve. Well, although there was fear of witches, in those times there were also many who would seek people out, old women or sometimes men, who were thought to have the knowledge from hedgerows, knowledge of the old ways. Perhaps they sought them for some herbs to cure their ills, or perhaps for a potion to attract a loved one. And there are many stories around Scotland that are similar to this one that I will share with you now. But this particular version comes from Shetland. And there were some men wanting to travel to the next island to collect some peats. And they didn't want to take too long. So they visited a witch, hoping that she would grant them some favourable weather to take them across the sea. And when they saw the witch, well, she offered them a string with 3 knots in it. And she said, if you buy this string, you take it with you. If you undo the first knot, there'll be a good breeze to start you on your way. If you undo the second knot, then you'll be able to travel a bit faster. But whatever you do, do not undo the 3rd knot. And the men, they took the string and off they went to their boat. They set the sails, they undid the first knot, and a gentle breeze set them off on their way. Wanting to make good time, they undid the next knot, and the wind grew stronger and blew them well. And so they thought, this is all working very well. Why not undo the 3rd knot? And on doing so, as you might expect, up blew a terrible storm. Their boat was wrecked. And the men, I fear they drowned. So be careful and heed those warnings. Now another tale, and this one is quite a favourite of mine. It concerns a fisherman who stayed near Kintail. And one day, when he was out at sea, what should happen but a great storm blew up. Now whether somebody was drowning a cat, whether somebody was beating a wet rag, or whether there were some careless men undoing that 3rd knot I don't know. But a storm blew up, and the fisherman on his small boat, he was sent careering through the waves, and it looked like he might crash upon the rocks. But with his skill, he managed to steer his boat, and his only other option was to run it aground. And up the sands and the shingle it crashed. The boat, mostly, was in good condition, but the keel was broken. At least the fisherman had been spared with his life. And he got out. He walked up and down that shore, but he could not see any timber that he could use to make a new keel to repair his boat. And it was getting late. And there he saw a cottage. And thinking to be too far from home to get that night, he would ask if he could shelter there. And in the cottage, there were 3 old women. They weren't too keen to let him in at first, but after a bit of persuasion and some friendly talk from the fisherman, they agreed, and they let him to stay by the fireplace to warm himself up after the day that he had had. And after some time, the 3 old women, they moved to the far end of the cottage, and they started talking amongst themselves, but not that the fisherman could hear. And they came back to him and said, "You can stay here by the fireplace tonight. You'll be warm enough there." He said, "Well, sitting up is not going to give me much sleep, and I'd like to be able to be well rested for tomorrow to find a good keel to repair my boat." So they agreed he could stay in the bed. There was only one bed in the cottage. So the fisherman got into it, and he pulled the covers up, almost hiding his whole head, with just enough to peep out from, and pretending to be asleep, he listened to what the 3 old women were saying. "Well, tonight's a good night for it," they said. And he went to a chest, and he opened up that chest, and inside he saw one of the old women pull out a red cap, put it onto her head, and she said, "London again!" And she vanished. The next old woman took out from the kist a red cap, set it on her head, and said, "London again!" And she vanished. And then the final old woman took out a red cap, set it on her head, and said, "London again!" And she vanished. Well, with that, the fisherman, he couldn't resist it anymore. He went over to the kist, and inside it there was one more red cap. He set it on his head, and he said, "London again!" And the next he knew, he was there in a whiskey cellar with cask after cask after cask, with the taps open and the beautiful liquor streaming out onto the floor. And what should he see on the floor but 3 old women, completely drunk and asleep. Well, he set to closing the taps, but making sure he took a little of the whiskey for himself. After all, he needed it that day. He perhaps took more than he'd intended, and soon enough he was asleep himself. When he awoke, it was due to a kick, and there above him was the landlord of a tavern. "Ah, you rogue, I've caught you now. I've lost so much money, so much whiskey through you spilling it all over the place, and now you'll pay." And then the constable was fetched, and the fisherman, he was taken off to the court, and all the whiskey and all the money that had been lost was explained, and he was sentenced to death for theft of the whiskey. He was taken off to the gallows, and the hangman, as he prepared the noose for the fisherman's neck, the fisherman reached into his pocket, and what should he find but the red cap. And he asked the hangman, "Can I put this on my head?" The hangman said, "Well, you're near the end. You can put what you like on your head." So he put on the red cap and said, "Kintail again!" And off, flying through the air, went the fisherman with the noose around him, and the gallows, and the hangman clinging to the gallows. And over the sea, the fisherman gave the hangman a push, and he fell. He took the noose off, and there he was, back in Kintail. And that gallows beam, well, didn't it just make a fine keel for his boat?